an original MCM production.
So now that's all our club business, so we should get on to the program. And to do that, Chris Heinrichs is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, President Joanne. Public Policy Forum and Rotarian, of course, President Rob Henken is going to present the forum's recently released report on the City of Milwaukee's revenue structure. I think you're going to find the report extremely interesting. It's called On the Money, and it finds sharp distinctions between Milwaukee and similar-sized cities when it comes to financing the workings of city governments. That finding and a deeper review of 4 of Milwaukee's peers suggests that changes in the city's revenue structure should be considered to ensure better reliability, balance, and equity. Rob will present the forum's modeling of different revenue frameworks and discuss what they mean to taxpayers and city finances. And as always, the forum's reports are nonpartisan in nature and really intended to provide a balanced and a, what would I say, sort of focused view of an issue, and to allow all of us to make our own conclusions based on the data. And I personally found it extremely interesting, so much so that I think this is the 5th time I have heard this presentation in one form or another. So with that, Rob.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I was thinking maybe I would wrap the presentation because you and a few other people in the room have heard it. So here I go. No, only joking. Those who know me know I don't rap. Seriously, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you and to dive into a subject that admittedly is a little bit wonkish, a little bit dry, but I'm going to try to keep this interesting and informative, and I really do look forward to the Q&A after we're done, because really the purpose of this report is to simulate what we hope will be a reasonable, objective, community-wide conversation, again, as Chris said, about the way that we finance the core vital services that the city government and the City of Milwaukee provides. So it's important to note that the report that I'm going to be discussing actually is a follow-up to a report that the forum released back in September. I have been before Rotary several times to talk about the deep dives that we do into local government finances. We take pride in the fact that we try to present this information in understandable ways. But again, we take very seriously, part of our mission, has been part of our mission for 104 years, is to be a watchdog over the finances of our local governments in this region. So we produced about a 70-page report that assessed the fiscal condition of the City of Milwaukee that was released last September, called Making Ends Meet. And I just want to review with you just a couple of the key findings in that report that spurred us to do this second report. So what you see on this screen, I can't make it any simpler than this. These are the ball game when we're talking about the city's revenue structure and city finances are these two revenue streams. We have intergovernmental revenue on the one hand, we have property taxes on the other. Obviously, most of you are very familiar with the latter, not as familiar with the former. What is distinctive about this slide? Well, one has stayed the same over the past 20 years, the other has increased. And again, that's a big part of the story. The way that we set up the financial structure for municipal governments in the state of Wisconsin, and we set this up, dates back to 1911, was that our state leaders said that we are going to have state government with the ability to use the income tax and later on to use the sales tax. We are going to commit that we will share the tax revenues that are generated by those two forms of taxation with local governments, both municipalities and counties throughout the state. And in return, however, we're going to be pretty darn restrictive in terms of what we allow our local governments to do. And indeed, that's a big dollar amount. That $263 million of intergovernmental revenue, I should say a little bit of that is federal revenue, but the vast majority is state revenue. In fact, $220 million of that $263 million comes from the state's shared revenue program. And so the thinking was, the state of Wisconsin is going to be pretty generous in terms of what it is giving back to municipal governments, but it is going to maintain these firm restrictions. And just to talk very specifically, when we think about the way that municipal governments in our state can generate revenues, in terms of major forms of taxation, not smaller fees, but major forms of taxation, the property tax is it. That's the one major form of taxation that we are allowed to use. So back to the slide, when I say to you that over this 20-year period, the city's single largest revenue source, keep in mind that the city's governmental fund revenues total about $834 million. The single biggest revenue source has not gone up in 20 years. Now that's a problem, whether you're a business owner, a nonprofit, worker, whether you're in government. If your single largest source of revenue is never going up, that's problematic. One of the problems is it puts a lot more pressure on your second biggest source of revenue, which is the property tax. So we have seen property taxes increase over this 20-year period. When we adjust for inflation, the picture sort of gets amplified a little bit. This, if the city's intergovernmental revenue had increased at the rate of CPI over this 20-year period, it would have roughly $150 million more today than it does. That's number one. Number two, when you look at the property taxes, while the increase is still substantial, when you compare it to CPI, it doesn't greatly outpace inflation. So that's reality number one about the city's financial structure. Reality number two comes on the expenditure side, because after all, when you're constrained on the revenue side, when your revenues are not increasing at the rate of inflation, then that is particularly problematic to the extent that you have expenditure pressures that are causing you to need revenue increases year to year that are either at or that outpace inflation. And in the case of the City of Milwaukee, the single largest expenditure category is the Milwaukee Police Department budget. What I'm showing you here is the 5-year growth in MPD expenditures between 2011 and 2015. And what is interesting about this is that the $60 million of growth in expenditures that you're seeing over this period actually exceeded the total revenue growth for all of city government over this period. So I see Paula Kiley sitting here in the front row. The libraries essentially didn't get any more money to spend because whatever revenue capacity the city was able to muster over this 5-year period essentially went into the Milwaukee Police Department. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, what's so bad about that? Public safety should be the city's foremost priority, and I'm not going to disagree with that notion. You may also be thinking to yourself, well, that's okay. To the extent that these extra resources allowed Chief Flynn to grow his sworn strength, allowed the department to invest in new technologies to better fight crime, then again, maybe you'd have a different outlook. But in reality, that didn't happen. This increase is what was required simply to keep pace, simply to accommodate the cost to continue for the Milwaukee Police Department over this 5-year period. So in summary, again, it's a 70-page report that I'm summarizing for you in 4 slides. But in summary, there's a revenue issue in that the single largest revenue source isn't growing. The second largest revenue source is growing, but that too is constrained by property tax limitations. I didn't show you fees. Those are growing, but there are constraints on those as well. So there is a revenue issue here, and there's also an expenditure issue in that for a variety of reasons that I don't have time to get into, police department needs to see increased spending every year just to keep pace. So that's my backdrop. Now let's get into this report. The question that we really wanted to seize upon, and again, sizing up the situation was, well, how does this work in other places? Are we unique? Are other cities, peer cities throughout the country, experiencing the same type of push and pull between revenue needs and expenditure pressures that the City of Milwaukee is? And so, again, I've been before you several times. You know that the Public Policy Forum loves to do peer comparisons. In this case, we did peer comparison on steroids. We took a look at every single city across the country with a population between 300,000 and 1 million. We had to exclude those cities that are combined city-county governments, and there's also a handful where the city levies property taxes for the school district. So we took those out, and what we ended up with was a peer group of 39 cities, including Milwaukee. And this is what we found. We took a look at property taxes as a share of local tax revenue. So one of our foremost questions was, how distinct are we? How unique are we in terms of our reliance on the property tax as our essentially sole source of local taxation? And we found out we are indeed quite unique. This is showing the 39 cities. The average is about 52% in terms of property taxes as a percentage of local tax revenues. We're at 96. The next highest is Minneapolis at 73%. So we're number one in this category. The next thing we looked at was reliance on state aids. And we were curious to see, again, the same question. And so what this graph is showing you is state funding as a share of essentially all government funding. So when you lump together local, state, and federal, what share does state funding comprise of that total? And here we're not number one, we're number three. But as you can see, the median is 14% of the peer city's budget consists of state aids. For the city of Milwaukee, we're at 48%. What else did we find? This takes a look at per capita local tax revenue, and this shouldn't be surprising because of our vast reliance on state aid, because of the structure that has been set up by the state of Wisconsin. We actually, when it comes to local taxation on a per capita basis, are very much on the low side. Now you may be wondering, but what about total spending? That's contained on this slide. So just to review, number 3 in terms of state revenue as percentage of total, intergovernmental, and local. Number 1, property tax percentage of local. Didn't get to this yet, but will in detail. Use of sales tax. We don't use a sales tax. We're the only one of the 39 that doesn't use either a general or a selective sales tax. So we're 39 there. I showed you 34 for per capita local taxes. When we combine all of these forms, we're right in the middle. And so it's tough to compare expenditures among municipal governments because municipal governments in different states are charged with doing different things. In some states, the city government runs the transit system or runs the convention center, or even in Minneapolis, owns and administers and maintains the Target Center. Here we don't. So it's tough to get apples to apples, but this question always arises, where are we in terms of total? We're right in the middle in terms of per capita governmental revenues from all 3 sources, state, local, and federal. So takeaways. 1, our tax structure is unique. I didn't get into it here, but it's in detail in the report, particularly in the Midwest. There are quite a few states that do have severe restrictions on what they allow their local governments to do with regard to revenue generation. But we are the only state in the Midwest that limits its municipalities solely to the property tax. And furthermore, and this really goes across the country, we are one of the only ones that doesn't set special rules for our largest city. Now, should we be setting special rules for our largest city? And again, I'm sure we could have a very interesting conversation about that topic. But when it comes to revenue generation, what we observe elsewhere in the country is recognition that the major city houses tens of thousands of non-resident commuters every day who come to work in the city, plays host to tens, if not hundreds of thousands of tourists and others who are coming to the city for entertainment and to frequent bars and restaurants, etc. And most states recognize that given that these are all users of city services, that there ought to be some means of taxation so that these users of city services are paying something directly into City Hall to support the services that they use. And this is where our absence of a sales tax is particularly striking. Again, 30 of the 38 use a general sales tax. Each of the remaining 8 uses selective sales tax on items such as restaurant and bar purchases or hotel motel rooms, some on parking, etc. We're the only one that doesn't have any type of a sales tax. We do have sales taxes in the city of Milwaukee that go to the Wisconsin Convention Center District. There's a half-cent county sales tax, but no sales tax revenue is flowing into City Hall. We find, again, that larger cities, so I didn't show you the background information for this, but we also looked at cities with populations between 150,000 and 300,000. We see less use of sales tax among smaller cities, greater use of sales tax among larger cities, which I think supports the hypothesis that I've forwarded to you, which is, again, larger cities are seeing many more users of city services who don't live in those cities. And again, not to beat a dead horse, but state aid is a minor source of revenue for most peer cities. Here, it is not. So those are takeaways. We then decided to do a deeper dive. We wanted to know a lot more about, very specifically, what's going on budgetarily in peer cities. And so we picked out 4. We picked out Pittsburgh, Minneapolis, Cleveland, and Kansas City. And we did a much deeper dive into their revenue structures. So I want to get into that for just a few moments. Once again, let's refresh your memory on the Milwaukee pie. These numbers look a little different. These are now 2015 numbers. We're using governmental funds as opposed to just the general fund. But again, you get the picture. 39% intergov, only 34% local taxes. When you look at the composition of our local taxes, virtually all of it is the property tax. And the secret here is that when we see other taxes, most of that are taxes coming in from tax incremental districts, which are also a form of property taxation. So essentially, I could pretty much argue to you that we're just about 100% in terms of that 34% slice of the pie. Nearly 100% of that is coming from the property tax. So let's look at some other pies. This is the Pittsburgh pie. And so here you see local taxes, 76%, intergovernmental, 13%. When we then take a deeper dive into the types of local taxation, you see many different types of local taxation. Property tax is still number 1, but you see many others. There's an income tax in Pittsburgh, a city income tax, 1%, just applied to residents. There's a payroll tax, 0.55% tax on the gross payroll of any employer in the city of Pittsburgh. You can see parking taxes. Pittsburgh gets a sliver of an Allegheny County sales tax, register of deeds. There's an amusement tax, which is a 5% tax on any ticket purchased for any entertainment event, whether it be sports or concerts, as long as it is at a for-profit facility. And we have a really interesting tax called the local services tax. So any person who works in the city of Pittsburgh pays a tax of $1 per week, $52 per year, that is overtly called a local services tax. This is a tax charged to you for your use of city services. So whether you live in the city or don't live in the city, you're going to pay $52 per year to help support city services. So this is the way Pittsburgh does it. We took a look for each of the 4 cities. We wanted to take a look through an objective lens. And so these 4 principles, balance, reliability, equity, and simplicity, are commonly used standards by government finance professionals for what you would want in an ideal revenue stream. So for each of the cities, we took a look and tried to assess how they measured up. So I'm not going to go into detail, but you can see, obviously, much better balance and reliability and equity in Pittsburgh than we have here because of the use of this variety of different sources of taxation. Not very simple, however, so that's where Pittsburgh scores low. Let's move on to Cleveland. Cleveland's model, when you just look at the pie, not that dissimilar from the Pittsburgh pie, but when you look at the form of local taxation, the Ohio model is very distinctive, just like ours, because Ohio allows its municipalities, not only allows, but requires them to be very dependent on a local income tax. In this case, however, Cleveland's income tax, and the voters just approved an increase in November from 2 to 2.5%, that's applied not only to residents of the city of Cleveland, but anyone who works in the city of Cleveland, who's a resident or not, and also to corporate income. So where Cleveland is not unlike Milwaukee is that most of its eggs are in one basket, though not all of its eggs, I would point out, in terms of its heavy reliance on the income tax, much lesser reliance on the property tax. You can see they do have some selective sales taxes on entertainment and parking and hotel and motel rooms. When we rated Cleveland, these are the rankings we gave. I'm not going to go into the detail. But again, lower on reliability and balance, of course, because of that heavy-duty reliance on the income tax. Minneapolis was next. Of all the cities we looked at, not just these 4, but the entire range of 39, Minneapolis' structure is the most similar to ours. Now, you still see, in terms of local taxes, 53% versus our 34%, intergov, 22% versus our 39%, but those slivers of those pies are closer to us than any of the cities that we looked at. And furthermore, when we looked at the type of local taxation used by Minneapolis, we found that the property tax was the dominant source. So again, not dissimilar from us, though they do mix in a half-cent general sales tax and also a franchise taxes on utilities within the city. Here in Wisconsin, only the state can do those types of taxes. And as you can see, local restaurant and bars and entertainment and lodging taxes. Here very quickly are our ratings for Minneapolis. Finally, Kansas City. And where Kansas City is distinctive is in its use of each of the big 3. So you can see that the pie looks pretty much like Pittsburgh's and Cleveland's, but here they're using earnings tax is code for income tax and applied the same way as Cleveland's to residents, non-residents, and corporate income. I believe theirs is 2%. Sales taxes, there's a 3% sales tax, general sales tax in Kansas City. Property taxes are number 3 on that list, but still significant, and you can see the rest. When we take a look at how we rank there, obviously they would be the envy of many budget officials in any of these cities in terms of their balance. Their reliability isn't as great because each of these taxes is subject to regular referendum. So they have to get their earnings tax reapproved by voters every 5 years. So again, there's lots more detail in the report that I'm not sharing with you that are sort of interesting tidbits about each of these cities and the way they generate revenue. We also try to give some perspective on the political considerations behind some of their decision making. So, takeaways again, Milwaukee. What this look really allows us to do is then examine our revenue structure through the lens of these 4 principles that I mentioned. Very clearly, we see how poorly balanced we are, low reliability, the fact that all of our eggs are in that one basket. During times of recession, property values tend to diminish more slowly than, say, income or sales. But when getting out of recession, they tend to rebound more slowly. So it's nice to sort of have a mix of a variety of different taxes. We don't have that here. Inequitable in terms of our reliance solely on those who own property, and by extension, those who rent, because obviously in rents, the property taxes are built in. But we are, again, not asking the tens of thousands of non-residents who use city services every day to contribute to city government, though they are contributing, obviously, to state government, and some of that's getting redistributed back. And again, far too reliant on state aid. So whether you agree or disagree with the state's posture, and it's happened under both Republican and Democratic governors of not raising those shared revenue payments, the fact is there's nothing we can do about it. There's nothing that city leaders can do if they have been essentially had imposed upon them a structure that makes them so reliant on this form of revenue that doesn't change from year to year. Finally, before getting to your questions, the last part of our exercise was to do some modeling. So we said, what if? What if models based on each of the 4 structures that I just described to you were applied to Milwaukee? And in our modeling, we said, look, we're not interested in developing models where the city's going to get more money to spend. Let's take the existing pie and let's imagine what that pie would look like and what the impact would be on property owners if we were to apply each of these 4 different models. So I'm going to run you through this very quickly. So one of them was the modified property tax model, and this one is based on Minneapolis. So what we did was we added to our mix a half-cent general city sales tax, an 8% entertainment tax, and a 2.5% food and beverage tax, only limited to the downtown area. That's the way it's done in Minneapolis. And so this is our existing structure, and this is what our structure would look like if we did these additional forms of taxation. And essentially what we have come up with here, and this is completely hypothetical and non-scientific, but we said to make our pie look like the other cities' pies, we'd want to reduce our state aids, whether that's a good policy decision or not. We'd want to reduce our property taxes, whether you agree with that or not, or feel instead the money should be spent on more city services. That's how we constructed our model. So we would generate $56 million in different taxes. You can see exactly what we do with it. In terms of property tax relief for the owner of a median valued home of $114,000 in the city of Milwaukee, you'd see it there, roughly about $160 of property tax relief. We can't calculate what the additional cost would be from the half-cent sales tax because that's based on individual spending. We go through pros and cons in the report. I'm not going to go through all of these. The one in red are the one that I just do want to highlight. In terms of the major pro, again, it's adding some diversification to the city's revenue base if we were to take an approach like this. The con, of course, is what would the impact be of a sales tax only in the city of Milwaukee? And it's a very legitimate question. The next one was sort of like the Kansas City model, but instead of doing a big 3, because we're going to do an income tax model in just a sec, we decided to do a big 2. So what if Milwaukee was roughly co-equally dependent on property taxes and sales taxes? So we'd have to do a much bigger sales tax to make that happen, 1.5%. We put in a 1.5% food and beverage tax because that's what Kansas City does. There's our model. Here's what this would look like under this scenario. And the summary, this would generate $141 million in new taxes. We'd put about $91 million into property tax relief. In this case, we'd reduce state aids by $50 million. If you're interested in the property tax impact, this would be the savings for your average median valued home. In terms of pros and cons, substantial property tax relief under this model. Again, this much larger general sales tax certainly would pose the threat of tax island consequences. The third one was the Cleveland model, an income tax model. We did this one exactly the way Cleveland currently does it. Here's our current structure. Here is what we would look like under the income tax model. Even more significant property tax relief of $141 million. State aids, again, we use the 50. And here you see a whopping almost $700 decrease in the property tax bill. Again, there are pros and cons. I think you could talk to 50 different people and they give you 50 different answers as to whether they would welcome the property tax savings in return for having to deal with an income tax. The effect of an income tax on our ability to attract and retain businesses to come and employ people in the city of Milwaukee. There are all sorts of legitimate questions here. But clearly, one of the pros on this model is that you are generating a sizable portion of your revenue from non-residents. Again, the biggest potential con in using an income tax is that it could make Milwaukee less attractive to both businesses and residents. And I would add, because we already have relatively high state income taxes, it would be more difficult than it would be in other states to add on a local income tax as well. Finally, we have our diversified tax model. In this case, we wanted to create a model that looked more like Pittsburgh. So we put in 4 different types of taxes that Pittsburgh uses. Here's what we get. Again, relatively substantial property tax relief. Here's how we would divide up the alternative taxes. And you can see property tax relief of about $500 for the average homeowner. So, in terms of pros and cons, this gives you a lot of diversification. Each of these taxes is relatively small. Relative is a relative term. Those are some strengths. In terms of cons, having all these different forms of taxation, number one, it's going to be more complicated for residents and visitors. Number two, you'd probably have, if you want 8 different types of taxes, you're going to have 8 different constituencies opposing those taxes. So clearly, those could be some detriments. So, to wrap up our conclusion. Number one, so I stressed to you that our model was hypothetical, but I will now say to you that in my humble opinion, this is a conversation that we should have, and the starting point for the conversation should not be about whether the city needs more revenue, regardless of the fact that that may be a very legitimate need, but instead, again, should focus on these 4 principles. And isn't it time? I could argue to you that this current structure, it's not working for City Hall. It's not working for state leaders. That $263 million, while the city makes the point that it's never gone up and that revenue isn't truly being shared anymore, it still is a sizable chunk of money for a state government that has its own needs. Given the fact that this doesn't seem to be working for anyone, shouldn't we stop backing away from this elephant in the room and have a serious conversation about whether, if we were to start from scratch, what would be the best type of revenue structure to create that would be best for our citizens, best for our local economy, best for our business community, et cetera, et cetera. Without question, there are no silver bullets. There are no easy answers. All sorts of different combinations could be considered. There are both pros and cons associated with every single one of these forms of taxation. There are plenty of pros, by the way, associated with property taxes as well. We should get into discussions about whether these should be subject to referendum if we're going to make changes, whether they should be time limited, whether we would want to do this in such a way so that specific taxes are dedicated to specific uses. These are all questions that would have to be considered and that should be considered if we're going to go down this path. There are some relatively simple fixes, however, if we wanted to take action immediately. There is such a thing as a premier resort area tax, whereby certain parts of the state are allowed to do sales taxes. There are very few in the Dells and in Door County, but there's nothing to say that state statutes couldn't be tweaked a little bit to make Milwaukee eligible, because after all, many would argue we are a premier tourist area, to do a small sales tax within a prescribed boundary. And so there's also a county sales tax that hypothetically, like Pittsburgh, could be, the state statutes could be tweaked to allow an add-on and some of that redistributed back to the city. So hypothetically, again, none of these are easy because you'd have to get the state legislature to approve them, but you don't have to reconstruct the whole thing. That's not for us to decide whether we should engage in piecemeal reform or in comprehensive reform. But again, we think it's pretty indisputable that some change is needed here, and we think that we can have an adult conversation in this community, despite the use of this dreaded T word, particularly if we're talking about different types of taxation, not more taxation, and that it's a conversation we need to have. So I'll end there. So the question was, have we looked at the impacts if Milwaukee were to establish new taxes on the surrounding communities? It's a great question, and it makes my head want to explode, even trying to decipher the answer to that question. And so the short answer is, we've thought about it, but I can't give you a good answer. I mean, I think that's part of the decision-making process here. I would say to you that I would not even be daring to stand here before you and broach this topic 10 years ago. I think the reason we can have this conversation is that the City of Milwaukee has built so many fundamental strengths. So the notion that if we had a small sales tax on food and beverage sales, that was going to stop people from coming to Milwaukee to frequent our bars and restaurants, I think that's a much tougher case to make than it would have been potentially several years ago. I think potentially, given all we have going for us, and that's why in other major cities like Chicago, the city does have higher taxes and appears to be able to get away with that. Again, you have to measure that up versus your strengths. But clearly a case could be made that if we're going to do anything here, maybe it should be done at a regional level, at a county level at least, to try to ease the impacts on surrounding communities. But it's a great question, and I think it's clearly one that has to be considered. Yes, sir. So the question was on the Milwaukee Police Department slide, and was that inflation adjusted? And no, that was in real terms, $60 million increase over the 5-year period. Yeah, it would be much smaller. And again, it's certainly not to suggest that the Milwaukee Police Department is just spending dollars hand over foot. Number one, as most are aware, public safety workers are not subject to Wisconsin Act 10. So in terms of the annual salary and benefits increases, the city has less ability to put a control on those. And there's a lot of need there. Also, during this 5-year period, a federal grant ran out, and the city decided to put in more property tax to not have to take cops off the street. But yeah, that's again, it's not at all to suggest that this is unreasonable. It's just to suggest it is what it is. In the words of my favorite football coach, Bill Belichick, but I won't go there. Yes, sir. Great question. The question was, we did the deep dive into revenue structures. Did we look into expenditures? And we did not a deep dive. So for the 4 peer cities in the report, we do show categorical spending. We wanted to do that, and frankly, I still want to do that, so maybe we'll do it, and I'll come back here in a year or so ago and present the findings. But as I mentioned earlier, it's very tough to do because so much of what cities spend depends on the structures that have been set up by their states and the delineation of responsibilities between cities and counties, and that's different in virtually every place you look. So it's very difficult to do apples to apples. We have done some work in previous reports on looking at per capita police spending. But I got to tell you, that's difficult too, because the fringe benefits are such a big part of it, and some cities, they allocate the fringe benefits to the department, some don't, so it gets very complicated. So again, great question. I think it would take some rigorous work, but you're not the first to ask that question. I think we need to do it, and so I'm hoping that we will. Yes, back there. Virtually all of these have made modifications, and I didn't go all the way back, but I would suggest to you that those 4 cities probably looked a lot more like us 50 or 60 years ago. So in Pittsburgh is a perfect example. Pittsburgh was on the brink of bankruptcy in the early 2000s. And Pennsylvania state law says that if things get bad enough, the state essentially appoints a receiver. The Pittsburgh budget director told me the best thing that ever happened was when the state had to come in and do its own deep dive into their finances and recognize that there were certain structural realities here. You know, it wasn't fiscal mismanagement, it just the numbers weren't working. And so at that point in time, they did that payroll tax, they did the local services tax. The business community actually embraced the payroll tax, and you may be thinking, why would they do that? At the same time, they were able to get rid of some business nuisance taxes. I don't know specifically what they were. So there were some trade-offs there. When we look at Minneapolis, their sales tax came about when they decided to make the big plunge into building downtown arenas for the Twins and the Vikings, new convention center. And so originally those started off as funding sources to support debt service on those venues, but now they're mixed into the city's general fund and they're helping the general fund. So I can give you those examples. Kansas City, I know, has added to its sales tax via voter referendum on a couple different occasions just in the last 10 years or so. Chris. So Chris asked, she asked me to rank on a scale of 1 to 10 the level of understanding of our state legislators about this issue, and then what can we do to promote understanding. We've talked to state legislators. I mean, this debate isn't anything new. I mean, we held a viewpoint luncheon back in December on the state-local relationship. I mean, we've seen this fight going on for years. On the one hand, you have local government officials saying, our state aids never increase. You promised that as your revenues grew, you were going to share some of that growth with us. You have not fulfilled that essential compact and promise. On the other hand, we have state leaders saying, hey, we have our own fiscal challenges. You guys need to look into managing your ships more tightly, et cetera, et cetera. Where it's most pronounced is in our major cities, because our major cities are most dependent on state shared revenue. And I don't know that there's a full level of understanding of just this straitjacket. And unfortunately, there may be cases out there of areas where cities are spending money that state legislators don't agree with. You get my point. And so they're able to use that as anecdotal evidence that, no, it's a spending problem, not a revenue problem. So maybe I'd give it a 5. In terms of our hope, we thought a state budget would be done by now, and we knew that this report was not going to impact this state budget. Our timing was to say, can we get this conversation started, and can we get the business community to lead it? Because really, I think the big question is changing the structure. If this is not going to make us more economically competitive, then why should we do it? So, but if we could get the business community to want to have this conversation, can we take that to Madison and have it? And I don't know where it would end up. I'll go to George and then Mustafa. Yeah, so the question was, would JCI want to come downtown if there was an income tax here? And I guess,
and the property tax
right.
would also be lower.
Right. So the only way I could answer that question would be to analyze what the income tax would cost, what type of impact that might have on people wanting to work at Johnson Controls versus the very real and substantial property tax relief that they would get. I think the income tax, and this is just my opinion, it would be a much tougher proposition than a sales tax. Not because I think that in general, income is any better or worse of a form of taxation, but again, because we already have high income taxes here, and because it's that much more obvious to people, I think it would be a tougher road to hoe. Then again, I could also craft an argument that it's more progressive than a sales tax. So it's the question that needs to be asked, George. I can't give you an answer. Mustafa. So the question is, if we don't do anything and continue on this same road for another 5, 10, 15, 20 years, are we going to see big trouble in terms of potentially even bankruptcy for some of our cities in this state? And, what led us to want to really dive here is we think we're getting close to a precipice in Milwaukee where we're not talking bankruptcy by any means. This is a well-managed government. It has lots of assets. But we are talking, the first thing that would happen is we would see service reductions. And the mayor has already warned that even in this budget, we may be looking at a reduction in sworn strength levels for the Milwaukee Police Department. And again, we've looked at the numbers as objectively as we can. We can see the math doesn't work. We already see that all other departments outside of police and fire and public works, because they're funded by fees, has seen cuts over the years. So I think that's the first shoe that would drop, is we'd see service reductions. And that's a value judgment. I mean, I'm not going to tell anyone that they should pay more in taxes to maintain existing service levels. I think we need to be honest about this. You know, some will have different answers. They would be okay with a reduction in service levels if the libraries aren't open as often. But I think when it comes to public safety, I think when you think about the need for public health nurses in this community, I think we will start to see real impacts unless something gives here, and we've documented that. So if folks want to read our September report, you'll get more insight into that question. And I think I'm going to get the hook. So thank you, everyone.
An MCM production.